The Sherpa's Podcast Picks is presented in cooperation with Thresher PR, which is headed by Stephen Joyner. We now take you to the Sherpa Chalet, where Jim the Podcast Sherpa will be interviewing podcasters near and far. Personally, if you've ever stood next to the Sherpa, you'd hope it will be far. That new yak-scented shampoo isn't getting him any new friends.
Welcome to the Sherpa's Podcast Picks. It's the podcast about, podcasts. And now, coming to you from Mount Podcastia, here's your host, who wonders what's on your podcast playlist, Jim the Podcast Sherpa.
Hello there, rebels of the Sherpolution. Welcome to the Sherpa's Podcast Picks. It is me, Jim the Podcast Sherpa, coming to you from Sherpaloo Studios here in the Sherpa Chalet, high atop Mount Podcastia, where I get to overlook the millions and millions of podcasts that are out there. That's right. You've tuned into the right place. Tuned in. Do people tune in anymore? I don't know. We're going to have to check that. I'm going to be doing a little research. But anyway, if you want to find out about some podcasts, this is what we call the Sherpa Samples episode. And there are 20 podcasts that have gotten my ears all over them. Or, I don't know, that doesn't sound right either. I can't talk today. But anyway, I'll be telling you about some of the podcasts that I've been checking out that are out there on the charts. And maybe there's some that you might want to listen to in addition to this one, of course. So without any further ado, why don't we head on into Sherpa Samples. All right, so let's move on to Sherpa Samples. And if there's a podcast that you'd like me to check out, do me a favor. Drop me a line on social media at Sherpolution. Did I whistle? Sherpolution? Or email me at jimthepodcastsherpa at gmail.com. I don't know why I'm whistling. Maybe I'm springing a leak somewhere. I don't know. But let's move on, shall we? Really diverse selection here out of the stuff that I checked out. And the first one we will talk about is something called the No Rogan Experience, KNOW. And it's two gentlemen who've never heard the Joe Rogan Experience podcast. And they fact check the guests that are on there to see how much of it is, lollygook. And how much of it is truth? I don't know what lollygook means. And the episode that they listened to was when Mel Gibson was on it. He had talked about a lot of religious stuff. So they were kind of debunking and whatever, everything that he had to say. As far as a spy podcast, there's one that is now called Cover. And this had to do with someone who was known as Steak Knife. I'm doing a lot of spelling this week, but not steak like a meaty steak, like stakeout, Stake. And this had to do with finding a man who was in deep cover, who was with the IRA, not the IRS, the IRA. The Nextlander Podcast is a discussion about games and gaming. And there's a crew of people who talk about that. So if you're into that kind of stuff, maybe this podcast you would be interested in. So, all right. So you were thinking, well, what would that be about? It's about a journalist named Jeff, and he goes down a lot of different rabbit holes and talks about different subjects really each week. I think the one that I was listening to, he was experiencing hockey because he didn't really follow hockey much. I don't really follow hockey much either. Yeah, but he does all different things. And I think he was talking about trying new things for 2025. So, Jeff, good luck to you. Hamish and Andy's Remembering Project. We had talked about Hamish and Andy a while back. They hosted a radio show, I believe, in Australia. And this is just flashbacks to their old radio show and kind of like the Sherpa Selects of their radio show. Pablo Torre finds out. Pablo Torre is a journalist. And again, he's kind of like the solo right guy, Jeff. He goes down a lot of different rabbit holes. And along with that, he does a lot of investigation. And he has guests on the show. And they talk about a lot of news and sports and whatever the headlines may be that are out there. Interestingly enough, one of the guests was a lady named Katie Nolan, who is also on this list of podcasts that I listen to. And it's called Casuals with Katie Nolan. and that is a discussion about sports. So yeah, it's a little sports podcast there for those of you sports lovers out there. Mantra with Jemma Sbeg. I believe she's essentially like a life coach, and these are like a lot of life affirmations to make your life better. And she picks like a different one each week and shows you how to focus on it. Very positive stuff. If you're into positive thinking, this might be a podcast that you may want to listen to. There were a few that I caught on Spotify, which were interesting because some of these Spotify ones, I like how they're kind of ahead of the game with this, with mixing in of visuals and animation. Like, oh, Sherpa, there's YouTube. I know, but this is just different. Duncanyounot, that is one word. I guess the guy's name is Duncan, and he was talking about masculinity. Very funny, this guy. I wonder if he's a comedian. I'm not really sure. I don't know too much about him, but really an interesting guy, an interesting speaker. The podcast was very funny to watch, and he was really entertaining. It wasn't that long, but I liked what this guy had to say. I would keep an eye on him. I think in the future he may be very popular. And there's another podcast called Ryth. And Ryth is an animated podcast on Spotify also. There's kind of like a lot of rants on this podcast. Again, it was very entertaining. I love the way that that these things are thrown together. The other one that I really enjoyed was, what was it called? Chains FR, I believe. So if you're on Spotify and you need something visual, I just really got a kick out of the animation for this one. So very, very enjoyable. And for history podcasts, there was one called History's Heroes. I think they are doing a segment of this called History's Youngest Heroes. The topic of it was Julian of Norwich, who was somebody that he was kind of sequestered away during a bad pandemic and had to do with some of the visions that she had. It was really interesting stuff, very heady. You can kind of see how it kind of ties into history if you listen to the episode, but very well done stuff. Speaking of history, I checked out a podcast called Endless Thread, which is actually a radio show that was made into a podcast. And they interviewed a gentleman who wrote a book called Sandwiches of History. And what he did, this is really fascinating. He went through a bunch of old magazines, I guess like all the old Good Housekeeping things and stuff like that from like the 20s and the 30s. And he made the sandwiches that were listed in recipes in there, and he tried them out. And I guess he did it on YouTube, I believe. Some of them were really wacky, but he was enjoying all of them. And it was a fascinating conversation. I like how they kind of go into these little unique topics to hold your interest. Speaking of holding your interest, what? Seriously? That's the name of the podcast. And they cover a lot of unique things in history as well. The episode that I checked out had to do with linking, okay, get ready for this, guinea pigs and the mafia. I'm not making this up, rebels. And believe it or not, it also ties into scurvy. I know you probably can't even draw a line through that, but really enjoyable. I believe the hosts were British and Australian, one British, one Australian. Really fascinating stuff. Interesting trivia, to say the least. And I guess while we're talking about history, there was a podcast called Breaking History. The episode that I checked out was very fascinating. It had to do with drawing parallels between the political careers of Donald Trump and Andrew Jackson. Now, you wouldn't think that there would be that many similarities, but there were a lot of things where you could draw a lot of parallels between their lives, weirdly enough. It was very well presented and also very fascinating stuff. A lot of really different things. On a related note, there was a podcast called Origin Story, and they talk about some of the topics among politics, like wokeism and centrism and all that other stuff. The episodes that I checked out dealt with fascism and Donald Trump. So take your pick. Either Donald Trump is a fascist or he's affiliated with Andrew Jackson. I don't know. His face isn't on any money anyway. Either way, we'll just leave it at that. And I think this is actually a good time to tell you that, even though I listen to a lot of these political podcasts, many of them have a conservative viewpoint. Some have a liberal viewpoint. A lot of podcasts dealing with religion have been very popular and high on the charts lately, and I've been checking those out. You'll notice that I don't really get into too much detail about those episodes. They're not meant to endorse a specific type of philosophy. These are just the podcasts that are on the charts, and I'm telling you about them. That's really it. So please, don't read anything into it. I don't think that whether I talk about this type of podcast or that type of podcast, it actually affects the actual podcast that I'm presenting to you. We're neutral. We're like Switzerland. Mount Podcast isn't that far away from Switzerland, by the way, Rebels, just in case you are looking for me. What else do we have here? Oh, if you wanted to talk the stocks, I believe from the British press was a podcast called Unhedged. And they talked about a lot of different stocks and looking forward to 2025 and some predictions that did or did not come true that they made in 2024. I've got one other political one. Free Thinking Through the Fourth Turning. I thought that this was like a spiritual podcast. No, it is hosted by a lady named Sasha Stone, also a very politically oriented podcast. I believe it was kind of conservative. It was a while since I've heard it, so I'm sorry if I don't remember all the details. But yes, that's what that podcast is, Free Thinking Through the Fourth Turning. Misquoting Jesus, I guess you could kind of figure out that one, is a religious podcast. And there are a lot of discussions with church leaders and religious figures, as well as various discussions on religion also. That there had to be some true crime in here, right? How can I do 20 podcasts and not listen to a true crime one? This one is like a scammer one. This one was really weird. It's called The Con, Caitlyn's Baby. And this was about a young woman who told people that she was pregnant, and she was working with doulas and midwives, and we know there's a difference between them. And she was acting out like all these situations were going on with her, like she was going into labor and all these things were happening, and she was talking to them on the phone. But in reality, these things weren't happening, and they don't even know if the woman was actually pregnant. Why she was doing this? Well, I guess the podcast gets into that. It's really, really kind of creepy in a way, but again, a really well-made podcast. I got to tell you that. Definitely built that kind of creepy suspense. And lastly, family trips with the Meyers brothers. For those of you who live in the United States, Seth Meyers is the host of a late-night TV talk show, and his brother Josh, I believe, works in Hollywood, if I'm not mistaken. And they talk a lot about taking trips, and they have a lot of guests on who talk about, their travels as well. And the guest that they had the week that I listened was Brooklyn Beckham, who is the son of soccer player David Beckham, and of course, former Spice Girl, Posh Spice, Victoria Beckham. So they talked about all sorts of stuff too. And this guy's got some hot sauce things going on as well, just in case. See, Brooklyn, okay, you owe me some money. I just did a free plug for you. Speaking of free plugs, I'm going to just free plug myself into the outro. Yeah, that'll work.
Want to join the rebels of the Sherpalution? Follow us at Sherpalution on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky.
Thanks so much for spending some time with me here at the Sherpa Podcast Picks. We've got new episodes coming out every Wednesday, and most of the time anyway. And on Saturdays, we have our classic episodes. We call them the Sherpa Selects. Those are the favorite episodes from the first 6 seasons. Yeah, and we just want to get them on the YouTube channel, which you can also follow if you aren't listening on podcast apps everywhere. And if you would like to find our YouTube channel, just look for Sherpalution, just like you can with social media, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky. Yeah, I think that covers it. I just forgot for a second. I guess we will say farewell, rebels. So until then, I say to you, Viva la Sherpalution!
Thanks for listening to the Sherpa's Podcast Picks. The podcast is now over. Please disperse and tell everyone about us. As long as they don't put us back in jail. Viva la Sherpalution!